So we started a series last week, and our series was entitled Imago Dei. And if you guys remember, Imago Dei is the Latin word, the Latin phrase that means image of God. And we specifically chose that phrase because that specific phrase in Latin holds a ton of theological significance and historical weight to it. And so we wanted to give that phrase specifically instead of just saying imago or image of God, because we wanted it to carry some of that weight. And we're going to go into a little bit what that is this morning. We're going to talk about God and his image bearers. But right now, we're setting the foundations of what we're going to do in the coming weeks. We're going to this idea of Imago Dei, it deals with all of the issues that we have in our society. And we're going to get into some of those: sexuality and gender and marriage and environmentalism. All of it boils back down to this. But we have to set foundations before we can move into any of those issues. And last week, Dad did an awesome job about talking about the most significant sentence in all reality, and that was Genesis 1. And he said that everything boils back down to that sentence, and it's absolutely true. And if I could summarize everything that he said last week, I would summarize it in a simple argument with three premises and a conclusion. And the first one is that God created everything, so he owns it with creator rights. Number two is that God designed everything, so he knows how it's supposed to work. He has a purpose for it. Number three is God is good, so his designs and his purposes are the best designs imaginable. And from those three, the conclusion is, therefore, we, as his creatures, have a moral obligation to submit to his purposes in order to thrive like he intended. That's a summary of everything that he said last week. And listen, as we go into this sermon series, and as I talk today, if you struggle with anything that we're talking about, if you're struggling to deal with it or submit to it, all of it boils back down to either you've lost sight of those truths or you have a distorted view of God. One of the two. And we do have a distorted view of God often, and so we struggle to submit to him and to realize that his purposes are good for us. But listen, if God's character is good and his purposes are good, then we can have total confidence to trust in the guidelines that he's set up for us, even if we don't fully understand them. And instead of rebelling against his boundaries, we should be running to his boundaries, because within the boundaries is everything we need to thrive as humans. Psalm 16 says that everything good is within the boundaries that God has set up. And Jesus tells us in John 8:32, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. God gives us boundaries, but within the boundaries is everything good. And we have to press on to know God and to submit to the reality of his boundaries if we want to thrive in our purpose. And so that's all a review. Where we're going this morning is we want to get to Genesis 1:26, where God creates man. Because I want to ask the question, what is the Imago Dei and why does it matter? That's where we're going. But I made the mistake of studying the 25 verses before verse 26 this week. Mistake. And so I'm praying this morning that I can get my jaw off the floor long enough to speak and to explain some of the things that I found. Because listen, our God is unbelievably awesome. And if you only hear one thing this morning, hear that, please. I want you guys with me to be absolutely stunned at who God is, so that when we talk about his images, you're blown away by how radical it is that he made images of himself. We can't intentionally image God the way that we were intended to if we don't see him for who he is and treasure him as supreme as he's represented in Christ. So, with the excuse of review, let me make 8 observations about how epic God is from Genesis 1. And please, join with me in enjoying God in this. Exalt with me in a radically God-centered view of creation. So Genesis 1:1, In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Observation number 1, God is. Period. God is. The story of reality starts with God, it centers on God, and God is the chief end of all of it. The story of reality is radically God-centered. In the beginning, God. From this very first prepositional phrase in the Bible, God lets us know that he exists and that he cannot be contained. He existed before anything else was. I can't even say that in English accurately because I have to use a time construct to say that. God existed before anything was. Well, there wasn't any time, so I can't even say before. So even from that first phrase, God is saying, I won't be contained by anything. Before the universe was, God was. And listen, this is why when God wants to express himself later in the Bible, the name he uses is I am. Nothing defines me, nothing contains me. I am not becoming anything. I don't depend on anything or anyone. And listen, does the language of Genesis 1:1, does it sound familiar in the beginning? There's another part of the Bible that sounds just like that, doesn't it? Maybe John 1. In the beginning was the Word. Interesting, Genesis 1:1 says, in the beginning God. The word God there is Elohim, which is plural. So God is expressing from the very first part of the Bible that Christ is supreme from the very first words of the Bible. John 1:1-3 reads, in the beginning was the Word. That's Jesus, in case you didn't know. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were created through him, and without him nothing was made that was made. Do you realize that Christ created the cosmos? Do we get that? We tend to separate God from Christ. But the Bible makes it very clear Christ created the cosmos. That was Christ's view of himself. John 8:53, this is one of my favorite passages in the whole Bible. Jesus is speaking to the Jews, and the Jews ask him, are you greater than our father Abraham? And Jesus, he gives a whole paragraph, but he finishes the paragraph by saying, your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad. Well, the Jews trip out about this. They're like, who the heck do you think you are? You're not even 50 years old, and yet you're saying that Abraham has seen you? And Jesus responds here. This is awesome. Jesus said to them, most assuredly I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. Yes, I can't read that without my heart rejoicing. That's my king. I am. Do you realize the I am that stood before the Jews that day is the I am that blazed forth from the burning bush, was the I am that stood before Abraham, was the I am before anything else was. Colossians 1:15, Christ is the image of the invisible God, the supreme over all creation. For by him all things were created that are in heaven and that are on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created through him and for him, and he is supreme over all things, and in him all things have their being. You would be hard-pressed to find language that's more radically Christ-centered than that. The supremacy of Christ reigned and ruled from the very first moment of creation. And so you say, Clint, so what? We're talking about Genesis. Why are you spending so much time on Christ? We can't image Christ the way we were supposed to until we see him for who he is. We can't understand the Imago Dei without knowing the supremacy of Christ in all things. He is the perfect image of God. And more than that, we can't understand the breathtaking reality of the cross until we realize that Christ created the cosmos. Listen, until we grasp that Christ created everything and then he stepped down to be killed on a cross, we'll never understand the scandal of grace that he died in my place, that my soul should live. The I am before anything was, the God who is. And that leads to observation number 2. God is really big. Like big beyond what we can grasp. Listen, God created all reality by telling it to be. Do you get that? God said, universe, be. And it was. From the very first line of the Bible, we come face to face with a being that is weighty beyond what we can even comprehend. We don't put him in our boxes. He made the box. We don't contain him in our words. He invented language. We don't fit him in our brains with our theological systems. He made our brains. Listen, I came face to face with this week, and it floored me. I was wrestling with what to say in this message, and I wasn't quite sure where I was going. And so I made an outline. I did my due diligence. I had 3 points. I had alliteration. It was nice, clean, a cute little outline. And as I was praying and asking God to reveal himself to me and tell me what to convey this week, it was almost as if he audibly spoke to me. And he said, Clint, how dare you package me in your cute little outline? You don't define me. He said, listen, I don't fit in your fun little flourishes of alliteration, and I will not be contained in your cute little outline. So I said, okay, Lord, what do I say? And he reminded me of Exodus 3, when Moses asked God, who am I and what should I say to them? And God said to him, tell them I am. And so that's what I'm here to say this morning. God absolutely is. There's no way that I will capture him in this message that I have this morning. Listen, we don't contain him in our little church boxes. We don't put him on the shelf when we're done with our 10-minute devotions. We don't control his sovereign power with our selfish prayers. God is, period. He is the measure of all things. He is the chief end of all creation. He is good and dangerous beyond what we can imagine. He spoke the universe into existence. Let the weight of that fall on you this morning. Until we understand that I am is the fundamental foundation of all reality, we will never understand his images. We can't understand the value of who we were made to be until we are blown away by the reality of who God is. God is really big. Observation number 3. Because God is so big, he uses symbols to express himself. God created the heavens and the earth. And yes, for those of you guys who are paying attention, we're still in the first sentence of the Bible. It's that important. You ever wonder why the universe is so big and we're so small? You ever wonder about that? Listen, the universe is almost beyond our comprehension. 14 billion light years from side to side, from edge to edge. There's 100 trillion galaxies is the most recent estimation. 200 billion stars in each of those 100 trillion galaxies. I can't comprehend that. That's beyond what I can conceptualize. But at least I can put numbers on it, right? That gives us some hazy concept. Well, listen, the universe is big. It's huge to point to the power of God. Psalm 19:1, the heavens declare the glory of God. God made the universe absolutely massive to give context to his power, so we can have some visualization of how powerful he is. I read Job 26 at the beginning of the service, but he goes into all of the creation account, and then he gets to verse 14, and he says, all of this, all of the universe, are the edges of his ways. Literally, the threads on his garment. How small a whisper of him we hear, and the thunder of his power who can understand. So we get a glimpse of how big God is with the universe. See, God can't fully reveal his infinite character to finite creatures, and so he uses symbols to express himself. And this is going to be really important when we get to the Imago Dei. But the Bible is packed with symbols that God uses to express himself. The most obvious, rainbows, right? God gave it to us as an expression of his promise of faithfulness. The entire sacrificial system is symbolic. The cross is the most iconic symbol in all of history. Marriage, sex, gender, all of those things are symbolic that God has given us to express himself. Fatherhood. He expresses himself all throughout the Bible as being a father. But listen, God didn't create all these things. He didn't make fathers and rainbows and all these things and then decide to kind of fit his agenda into what he created. Acts 15:18 says, from all eternity, God knew his works. So God knew when he created that he wanted to relate to us in such a way. And so he created fatherhood in order to be a symbol of that relationship. Don't get it mixed up, the order of how God creates things. He has purposes and then he makes symbols. He doesn't make and then fit things into his symbols. Observation number 4. The command of God creates what it commands. So we have commands and we give them to certain things, and then those things, if they listen to us, they obey our commands. God just commands and stuff happens. Verse 3, then God said, let there be light, and there was light. God's not commanding something to become something else here. Before God commanded, there was no such thing as light. The existence of anything is a direct result of God's resources, his own power, a.k.a. he owns it. Listen, this is the pattern of all creation. I had them read the entire first chapter because there are patterns throughout this. Let there be, and there was. Let there be, and there was. Let there be, and there was. With 8 simple commands, God brings the universe into reality. How awesome is that? With 4 words, he brings light into being. And listen, this is the same command of God that raises the dead. With 3 words, Lazarus, come forth. Or 1 word in Exodus 16:6. In your blood I say, live. And Paul says this same powerful command, this same command to bring light, is exactly the command that shines the gospel into our hearts in 2 Corinthians 4:6. And so Dad talked about last week, if you don't believe the first verse of the Bible, where do you stop? Well, Paul says if you don't believe the 3rd verse of the Bible, you have no right to believe that the gospel has any power. And this is important because God depends on nothing to create, so he has no obligations to anything. God owns. He created by his own power. Everything depends on him for existence, and so he has creator rights and ownership over everything, including me. Observation number 5. God is a happy creator who creates good things. Genesis 1:4. God saw the light, and it was good. This is the pattern of all creation. This is another pattern. Let there be, and it was good. Let there be, and it was good. Do you realize that Paul describes God as a happy God in 1 Timothy 1:11? Does that change your view of creation a little bit? God's a happy God? Listen, let me put it provocatively. You cannot imagine a being that is happier than God. Perfect beauty and goodness, plus the perfect appreciation of beauty, plus a being who is capable of infinite passion and emotion. You put all those things together, and God is perfectly and eternally happy within the fellowship of the Trinity. That should change your view of creation, because God doesn't step out of his eternal happiness to create a world that he hates or to create a world that makes him miserable. That doesn't make any sense at all. In the overflow of his eternal happiness, God created. And so the things that he created are good. God has designs and purposes for the universe, and they are awesome. And that leads to observation number 6. God has total authority over creation. Verses 9 and 10. Then God said, "Let the waters under the heavens be gathered together in one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and gathering together of the waters he called seas. He names what he creates. Listen, in the ancient world, the context here, if you named something, it had huge importance, because the name of something signified its purpose, and it determined what it was for. And so if you had the authority to name something, you had total rights over that thing, because you could determine its purpose. Well, God has creator rights and authority to name reality. He names the day and the night. Listen, how powerful do you have to be to declare the purpose of the day and night? Are you guys understanding how awesome God is? Man. And this is directly in opposition to all of the religions around this. Genesis was written in the context of the ancient Near East. And around all of these things, all of these people worshipped these things as gods. They worshipped the sea. They worshipped the sun and moon. And God is saying here, no, I created those things. And not only did I create them, but I have the sovereign right to name them and to declare their purpose. I rule. Moses is saying, hey, by the way, Yahweh named those. Observation number 7, God rules time and determines its purpose. Genesis 1:16, then God made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day, and the lesser light to rule the night. Listen, you ever wonder why he doesn't name the sun and the moon? He names all these other things, and he doesn't name the sun and the moon. And he doesn't create it till day 4, even though there's light on day 1. You ever wonder about that? When you read the Bible, you should be wondering about these things. Well, he doesn't, because in the ancient Near East, the sun and moon were the highest gods they worshipped. And so, in essence, what God is saying here is he waits till the 4th day to create them. And then once he creates them, he doesn't even give them the dignity of being named. And then on top of that, he declares their purpose. So God is making an emphatic statement saying, yeah, those things in the sky, I spoke them into being. And by the way, I made light on day 1. I don't even need them to make light. I am God. He has a clear purpose for his creation. And here's a fun one. You ever wonder why the majority of the world functions on a 7-day calendar? Even though if you trace it back, a lot of the world hasn't had contact for a long period of time. It's an interesting one. And here's observation number 8. And this might be my favorite out of all of them. He created the stars also. At the end of verse 16, then God made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to the lesser light to rule the night. He made the stars also. Have you seen the night sky? Have you walked outside and seen all the stars? Only the God who is, only a God as great as Yahweh could create all of those stars and then add it to the creation account as a postscript. Are you starting to see the kind of being we're dealing with in Genesis 1? Ferociously powerful and supremely sovereign. He says, oh yeah, the stars, yeah, I made those too. It's kind of like I have a wood workshop in my garage, and I make all kinds of stuff, and I make big things like furniture and that kind of thing, and I'll bring Mackenzie out and show her all these cool things I've made. And I got little stuff just sitting around that I kind of fool around with, like coasters and that kind of thing. It's as if she walked outside and saw all this stuff, and she's like, oh, what about the coaster? And, oh yeah, I made that too. That's God with the stars. Isaiah 40:26, God is speaking here. He says, lift up your eyes on high and see who has created all these things, who brings out their host by number, who calls them all by name. By the greatness of his might and the strength of his power, not one is missing. I read recently there are more stars in the universe than all of the sounds and the words uttered by the human race since the dawn of creation. And yet God has a name for every single one of those, and he brought them into being. Listen, so if Genesis 1, we see God has absolute authority, we see that he determines the purpose for all things, and he is the measure of goodness, and oh, by the way, he made the stars also. And now that we have this view of God, that we've seen him a little bit, a glimpse of who he is. Now we can come to the crown jewel of God's creation. Now that our jaws are on the floor because of the infinitely powerful, all-knowing, unassailably happy God who is, we can finally look at his images. And so we come to the climax of creation in verse 26. And really, if you think of the whole creation account as God painting a portrait, he's putting his glory on display in creation. That's what creation is for. And you can think of it as he's painting this portrait of his glory. And you can imagine verses 1 through 25, he has the brushes of power and intelligence and design and order and beauty and bigness and majesty. And he's painting this portrait with all of these brushes. And then in verse 26, God changes brushes. He picks up a different brush. He picks up the brush of morality and relationship and will and authority. And he starts painting with the colors of his own character. And he paints a picture of himself into the portrait of creation. And so you come to verse 26, and God says, let us make man in our image according to our likeness. God's creative work comes to a climax here. And it's very different from anything up until this point. It's almost as if God has been creating all these things, and now he gets to the point where he's like, yes, I've set everything up. Now let's make man. Now let's form my image. And notice that there's a break in the rhythm when we come to the creation of man. I talked about this a little bit, but there's a rhythm of good, 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 very good. So there's a value difference when he creates man. There's also the rhythm of after its kind. So as he's creating the plants and the animals, after each one, he says they're created after their kind, after their kind, after their kind, after their kind. And then he gets to man, and he says, in our image. Well, if you translate that, it's after God's kind. That's what man is. And you see the rhythm of command is now interrupted by this divine counsel. So God is commanding, let there be and there was, let there be and there was, let there be and there was. And then it changes to this conversation among the Trinity. Let us make man in our image. And it's out of the overflow of this fellowship of the Trinity, the joy and the perfection of the goodness, they begin to paint their glory into creation. And then you notice the rhythm of the divine word is replaced by personal action. God commands everything else to come into being, but you notice with man that he handcrafts him from the dust, and then he breathes into his breath, into his lungs, the breath of life. God performs divine CPR on man. It's much more personal than the rest of creation. So, what we've seen so far is that if the God who is the fundamental foundation of all reality, and if the greatest display of power and creativity culminates with the creation of man in God's image, it's safe to assume that whatever God's image is, it's really important and it's really awesome. Bare minimum, it's safe to assume those two things. God, with unimaginable power, has just spoken reality into existence with design and purpose, and all of it was good. And then he steps in and creates his image, and it's very good. The image of I am. So now that we have an introduction, now we can ask, what is the Imago Dei? What is it? And first we have to ask, what does it mean to image something? What does it mean to image something? Well, very simply, image is image. Images display or they represent some reality or some original. So, at essence, we are in the image of God in that we image God. We put him on display. God is the reality and we are the representations. But it's really important to understand that we are not God. We simply display God. I have a picture, I think, in my... So I've showed you guys this picture before, but I took this picture when I was in New Zealand, and I think the picture is incredibly beautiful. What it does is it's not the reality, but it depicts the reality. It's an image that images what I saw when I was there. But it's really important to understand that as cool as this picture is, it doesn't even scratch the surface of how awesome it was to stand there in person. Same thing with images. We depict God's image, but we're not even close to how glorious the original is. And we have to keep that in mind. And as we look at this, we want to ask, well, what does the biblical language teach us? Because there's two words here that are used to describe the image, right? There's image and there's likeness in verse 26. And in Hebrew, those two words are tselem and dumut. And throughout the Bible, those are used as synonyms. They're interchangeable throughout the Old Testament, and really they're broad terms. It would be almost as if in English we said picture and image, or picture and photo. They're interchangeable, and they have a wide variety of use. And really, they don't give us any detail about what the image is here. They're used to emphasize the importance. Because in Hebrew, if you add one word after another, it's called parallelism, and it provides extra emphasis on what's there. So it's saying this is very significant, but it's not really giving us a lot of detail about what it is. So part of the biggest context of what this is was when it was written. I mentioned the ancient Near East earlier. And in this ancient context, kings would come into regions and they'd conquer the regions. And when they conquered the region, what they'd do is they'd either set up a statue or they'd set up a king, and they'd give him authority to be the representation of that ruler in that distant land. He wasn't the ruler, but he had imputed power from the ruler, and he represented the king that was. And in the Greek, the word for this is icon. It's the Greek word that was used of these images that are set up. And that word is used all throughout the New Testament to describe Jesus, who is the image that we are supposed to be. So we are supposed to be icons of God. And so with this idea of image and this concept of icons in the East, now we can kind of come to establish a definition of the Imago Dei. But let me make two clarifications before we do this. And the first one is, there is huge debate about what it means to be made in the image of God. I've literally studied for the past 2 weeks, and I've read all kinds of theologians, and it's across the board what the specifics are about what it means to be made in the image of God. And I have a theory on this, and I think part of the reason that there's not a lot of consistency is because the God who is not confined in language, and neither can his image be. God is so great and glorious that not even the reflections of him can be put in a nice little box. And I think that's part of it. But the other part is the image isn't the point. Listen, we tend to overemphasize the image, but you cannot overemphasize the God behind the image. The image is not the focus of creation. God is. And so at core, images are made to image some reality. We have to ask, why did God put 8 billion statues of himself on the earth? Why? It's to draw attention to God, right? There's 8 billion pictures of God on the earth because God wants to be seen. God is the point, and he's passionately dedicated to filling the world with himself. And so he gives images that point us back to the reality. Talk and feel and act in a way that we display what God is like. And that's good news for us because God is best. And so we get to see and show and know best in our responsibility to image God. And so we have to go from this reality that God is radically for God, and that God does everything for his glory in order to understand why he made us in his image. Man is a symbol that God created to express who he is. And so you guys should be saying at this point, give me text. I want Bible. So let's go to Genesis 1:26 and see if we can't tease out what the image is. And I'll start in verse 26. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." So all of that is this idea of representation. He says, let them have dominion. God is the creator. He has all the authority, and yet he makes these images that will have his imputed authority. They get to act on his behalf. There's representation. And then in verse 27, so God created man in his own image. So he made images to image him. That's reflection. We are made to reflect the nature of God. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. Then God blessed them and said to them. So God is now speaking to the images that he made, which implies a relationship that's there. He doesn't speak to anything else in creation at this level. This one-on-one interaction. He only does that with man. There's a relationship aspect of the Imago Dei. And he says to them, be fruitful and multiply. That's relationship to others. at core, right? He's talking about the most intimate kind of relationship that we can have with other human beings. He's talking about relationship between men and women. And then he goes on and says, fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And that's a relationship to nature. We are to have dominion over the created order. So we put those three things together, and we have reflection. We were made to reflect God's capacities and his qualities, his nature. But we were also given the responsibility to represent him and his ownership and his interests over creation. And then finally, all of that is done in this arena of relationship between God and man and the rest of nature. And so I wrestled with a definition. I like succinct, tight, packaged definitions. And I didn't get one. I have something that I think works and that gives an idea and a framework, but this will probably change as we go forward in this series. The main thing I want you to know is reflection, representation, and relationship. But with that said, here's the definition that we're going to go with. Imago Dei is the imprint of God's character on humanity that enables us to reflect his glory and represent his authority in relationship to God, each other, and nature. Imago Dei is the imprint of God's character on humanity, so he's imprinted his character onto the human race. And that imprint, it gives us certain capabilities. It enables us to reflect his glory. That's an intrinsic thing that we have. We don't do that intentionally, but we have capabilities that allow us to do that. And that then lets us represent his authority. So we have certain responsibilities he's given us as his icons. And all of that happens in relationship with God and men and the rest of nature. Or a shorter definition is the Imago Dei is God's definition for us to reflect and represent him in relationship. And so as we move on, we're going to explore this more, and we're going to unpack it more, and we're going to apply it to all of these different issues that we've been hinting at. But this morning, we're not going to unpack it. We're going to ask why it matters. Because you're not going to care about what the definition is, and you're not going to apply it to the way you live your life unless there's a certain weight to it, a certain significance to it. And so we want to ask, why does the Imago Dei matter? And first, we have to note that image is really important to God. We see this in Romans 8:28 through 29. And all of us are familiar with verse 28, but we often skip verse 29. We know that all things work together for good to those who love God and to those who are called according to his purpose. For whom he foreknew, that's who he knew beforehand, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. So what that's saying is that everything that happens, God orchestrates it and works it and repositions it so that he can conform people to the image of his Son. And we read Colossians 1 earlier. Christ is the image of God. And so when he's saying he's conforming us to the image of Christ, he's conforming us to the image that we were meant to be. God works everything to that purpose. Image is really important to God. And here's why. It's because image changes everything. The Imago Dei means that there is a rock-solid, irreducible, derived glory and significance and value to every single human being. When you walk through the grocery store, every single person you see is a unique reflection of the creator of the universe. Do you see how radical that is? Remember the creator we talked about? He created with a word. He made the stars also. He determines the purpose of day and night. And then he imprinted his worth onto human beings. Awesome. Awesome reality. Radical. And that value is the foundation of every single relationship that we have with people. Because every person we talk to and approach, they have the value and the imprint of the creator of the universe on them. Amazing thought. So it changes everything. But more importantly, this is what we were made for. We were made to image God. We exist. Our purpose is to magnify the glory of God with everything that we are. I was made to display the worth of God by reflecting Him and representing Him as I relate in such a way that makes Him look great. And I feel some of you are saying, oh, here Clint goes again. He's talking about the glory of God. He's on his glory horse. That's all he talks about is the glory of God over and over again. You sound like a broken record, Clint. You better believe I sound like a broken record. Listen, I was made for this. I was made for this. I was made to bring glory to God. I was created to know and enjoy and proclaim the glory of God and the supremacy of Christ. There's nothing better. There's nothing better that I could talk about. I will be a herald of the glory of God until the day that I die. And listen, in that day, the day that I die, I'm going to proclaim God's glory with all the more anticipation because I'm going to see it in a few minutes. Yeah, can I? No amens? None? Listen, you ask, all right, Clint, you're talking about the glory of God again, being satisfied in God, joy in God. How the heck does that relate to Imago Dei? I thought we were talking about being God's images. How did you get onto displaying the glory of God? Listen, you image God the way that you were made to when you're deeply satisfied in who He is. Or, God is best imaged as valuable when you show Him to be worth more than anything else. And I get this from Philippians 1:20 through 23, and this is amazing. This is my life. Paul says here, my earnest expectation and hope that in nothing I shall be ashamed, but with all boldness, as always, so now also Christ will be magnified in my body, whether by life or by death. What he's saying there is everything I aim at, my hope, my expectation, everything I do, whether I live or I die, all of it is aimed at magnifying Christ, putting Him on display, imaging Him the way that I'm supposed to. And listen, that idea of magnified, there's different ways that we can think of this. We can either think of magnifying glass or telescope. One is heresy and the other is worship. If you have a magnifying glass, you're bringing something that's really small and you're making it look bigger than it is. That's heresy. When I magnify Christ, I bring something that is unimaginably big and glorious, and I bring a little glimpse of it into better view. That's magnifying. That's the way I was made to image who Christ is. And here's the connection. So we asked Paul, how do you do that, Paul? How does Christ be magnified in your body in that way? And he makes an argument here in verse 21. He says, this is the connection, because to me to live is Christ. What's he saying? Everything in life is Christ. All of the best things in life are God and the things that He has bought for us. Christ is everything in life. But even more than that, to die is gain. The connection is verse 23. Because you have to ask why. Why, Paul? Why is death gain? How can you say something like that? And how does that glorify God? Well, you get down to the end of verse 23, and he says, I have a desire to depart and be with Christ. What's it say? Which is far better. Not a little bit better. Not marginally better. Infinitely better. What Paul is saying here is, if I die, I give up everything this world could possibly offer me. All of the comfort, all of the wealth, anything, the relationships, anything that I have in this life. If I die and give that up, gain. Because I get Christ. That is supreme satisfaction in who Christ is. If I can stand up here and say to you, if I die today, it's gain, that makes Christ look really good. And that's what we're made to do. We're made to image Christ. We're made to put him on display. And so you say, Clint, I don't feel that. I don't understand what you're talking about. I struggle with that day to day. Of course you do. That's what we lost in the fall. That's what we surrendered when we listened to Satan and bought into his lies. Satan said, don't be God's likeness, be God. Don't image God, be God. Make your own standard. Be satisfied in who you are. God gave us all of these good things, and he put them within these boundaries, and then he put one tree outside of the boundaries. And he said, everything that's good is in the boundaries. If you trust me and you stay in the boundaries, joy. If you step outside the boundaries, death. And Satan said, he's holding out on you. He's keeping that one thing from you. Go taste it. Try it. Be your own standard. And when we stepped outside the boundaries, we surrendered life. We died. Ephesians 2:1 says, you are dead in your trespasses and sins. And Paul talks about this exchange of image. We gave up the glory of God and how magnificent he is, the reality behind the image, and instead we traded it for an image of an image of an image. He says they surrendered the glory of God. They changed the incorruptible glory of God for an image in the likeness of corruptible man. And since we gave God up, God gave us up. And we lost the relationship we were meant to have as the Imago Dei. And the only way we get that back is the perfect image that came to earth. Christ is the supreme Imago Dei. He is the perfect image that we were meant to be. Hebrews 1:3 says, he is the radiance of the glory of God. How awesome is that wording? The radiance of the glory of God is who Christ is. He is the exact imprint of his nature, the perfect image. And the only way that we're restored to that image is when we see it for what it is. 2 Corinthians 3:18 says, with unveiled face, beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord, we are transformed into the same image from glory to glory. So as we see Christ, as we understand who he is, as we see the image that we're supposed to be, we're transformed into the image that we were made to be, the Imago Dei. But the only way that happens is when Christ does a miracle in our hearts. We started off saying how important the first sentence of the Bible is and how important the fact that God created is. 2 Corinthians 4:6, Paul ties the creation power of God to the renewal of the image within us. He says, "For it is the God who commanded light to shine out of darkness." You remember that God that we talked about? The God that created the world with a word? The God who named the day and night? The God who ordered time itself? The God who created the stars also? That's the God we're talking about here. He is the one who shines the light of the knowledge of the glory of God into our hearts in the face of Jesus Christ. So the only way we are restored in that image, the only way that we can ever say, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain, is when God shines that light into our hearts and renews us from the fallen image that we have become. We are distorted, and Christ renews us to be the Imago Dei that we were meant to be, that we were created to be. So we are made to know and image God, and that was distorted in the fall. And now all of God's creation power is turned to conforming us into the perfect image of his Son, so that we can say, for me to live is Christ and to die gain. Image is really, really important. We were made